One. Alrighty, hello everyone. Welcome to my YouTube channel. Just for clarification too, this series is my James's interview series where I interview different people that are either experts or lay people that are just very informed on different issues in theology, history, and literature. And so today my guest is Michael Hall. Michael, how are you doing today?
Pretty good. How about you?
I'm doing well. And Michael Hall is a graduate of Reformation Bible College. He has a bachelor's degree in theology, but you did a lot of concentration in philosophy, though. Is that right?
Correct. Yeah. Most of my program was the Christian thought major, is what they call it, which left us 7 electives, all of which were 3 credit hour electives, and I used all of those for philosophy. And then I wrote a senior research project, which was essentially a bachelor's thesis in philosophy on Wittgenstein. So basically, I have a major in philosophy, even though the paperwork doesn't say that. But if you look at what the paperwork details, it specifies, and basically, I have a degree in philosophy.
Gotcha. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, thanks for clarifying that. And without going into too much detail, because I do want to focus more on Wittgenstein today, you are in the process of becoming Catholic from Reformed. Is that correct?
Correct. Yeah. No, I am in the process of coming into communion with the church. I'm in discussion with priests at the ordinariate parishes in Orlando right now,
Oh,
Incarnation
nice.
Catholic Church and St. John Fisher. So I'm talking with those guys.
Nice, yeah. I've heard a lot of good things about Incarnation. A Facebook friend of mine, and also he's done stuff on Reason and Theology. Eric Ybarra, he also has his blog and coming out with
Okay.
a few books. He used to go there to
Oh,
Incarnation because he was Anglican and then became Catholic. So he was Anglican for a good while too, like High Church Anglo Catholic. Um, so yeah,
I
so
didn't know that. I had no idea.
yeah, yeah. So I recommend everyone watch. Eric has several conversion story videos out there, and also in context when he talks about Eastern Orthodoxy and the papacy. So highly recommend his stuff. Gonna have him on the show. Still trying to fix the date with him with that. So, but
That's super
anyway,
cool.
yeah, he's he's a machine. He's a for all those of you who watch Rick and Morty, he like Michael, he's a god Morty. um, so in the Saint Athanasius sense, God became man so that man might become God.
Not in the alcoholic Rick sense, where you're the
Yeah,
craziest scientist in the world.
yeah,
I mean,
atheist, nihilistic, just full on Schopenhauer Nietzsche.
that's just Wednesdays, dude. I don't know what you're talking about.
I
It's just
was gonna
Wednesday.
say I was gonna say Friday night, but you know.
Both.
um,
They're
so
not mutually exclusive.
it's like why one day, but no. um, so the first question I wanted to ask you is to set the stage and context for this conversation is how did you become interested in Wittgenstein, and also am I pronouncing that right, and how have others pronounced it, just for the audience?
Yeah. So with pronouncing his name, I've heard probably anywhere close to half a dozen different pronunciations. I've heard Wittgenstein, right? That's more of a anglicized, I guess, pronunciation. I've heard Wittgenstein. I've heard Wittgenstein. I've heard Wittgenstein, like where you just put them all together in one
Hmm.
um, syllable, which I cannot quite perfectly actually say it that way, but I've heard it that way. There's so many different ones. I don't really think it matters how you pronounce it. I just his name is Wittgenstein, so I remember when I was writing my thesis, everyone called him Witty, old Witty. And so, like, yeah, just call him whatever you want. He was a funny fellow, so I doubt he would be too offended. Um, and then how did I become interested in him? Yeah, so I came to RBC and then very quickly became interested in Thomas Aquinas. Kind of had like a philosophical conversion, as it were, to Thomism. Um, and then that was like baptism, right? And then I read Alistair McIntyre, and I read his book After Virtue, and that was kind of that was like confirmation. So then that kind of narrowed me in towards moral philosophy specifically. And then through studying McIntyre's works, Thomas, and Aristotle, reading Plato a lot, and then other just kind of sporadic philosophers here and there, like Anscombe, GEM Anscombe, and then Philippa Foot, and then just other people, other Thomists, and just kind of developing interests. That kind of led me towards an interest in anthropology, like philosophical anthropology, how it relates to ethics. And I did an independent study with Michael Sakassis on that while I was at RBC on anthropology and ethics, where I produced this paper critiquing G.E. Moore and various forms of emotivism on how their meta-ethical considerations actually alienate human nature in many ways, or the human being from their conception of ethical language. And that kind of really forced me to delve into borrowing quite a bit from people like Heidegger, actually, and Hannah Arendt. And so there's some existential phenomenology that I'm quite interested in as well. And that kind of pushed me to this point where I realized the importance about language in this whole discussion, because in the paper I ended up like whittling it down to, ethics needs to have some type of frame in order to refer to for it to be sensical. So, for example, G.E. Moore's famous question in Principia Ethica, what is good? Well, okay, the problem with that question is you're not asking a question about ethics, you're asking a question about the ontological status of goodness. That's not ethics, that's meta-ethics in its metaphysical form, or metaphysics just straight up. Like in medieval philosophy, that would just be metaphysics. You see that in St. Thomas's writings, John Duns Scotus, others, Augustine, right? And so this is like not the same question. And Aristotle remarks in Nicomachean Ethics, he says that we're only considered in the human good, right? Human virtue is what our subject matter is, not just the good indiscriminately. And so with Moore, it was like, okay, like you are removing this relationship to human beings and as a whole, as a holistic entity, and you're removing this relationship from your consideration of ethics. And this is why your project ends up ultimately failing. That was my critique, to put it very, 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 very simple. And in so doing, I put myself into a situation where I borrowed from Hannah Arendt her distinction between human essence and the human condition. And I blended that with Thomas's distinction between essence and existence. And I got this tripartite kind of division of the human person.
Oh, wow.
And actually, it's actually like something I want to go back to and work more on. And so that got me into Wittgenstein, because then I was kind of at the same time while researching and writing this, I was being exposed to him in other classes and hearing about him. And then also he kept coming up. Like McIntyre mentions him, Anscombe was his student, so she mentions him, and I was reading her. And I kept reading other books in philosophy, and his name kept coming up. And so I was like, this guy is interesting. So I looked it up a little bit, and I kind of got like a generic, like, he focuses on the philosophy of language. And that started to be really imposed in my understanding to see this is actually extremely important, especially if I'm going to argue that moral philosophy needs to be grounded in anthropology. The most peculiar contemporary form of focusing on anthropology, I think, actually is philosophy of language. In many ways, I think you can actually use philosophy of language to reassert old Aristotelian ideas under a new form, which most people would de facto reject because they see it as metaphysical. But if you present it under philosophy of language, I think often people see it as more reasonable, it's more palatable. And so that, and also just the conceptual relationship, led me to philosophy of language, and then that led me to Wittgenstein. It was just a hunch. It was like, it's like one of those research hunches that you have, like, this guy might have something for me. And then now I have basically 3 whole shelves of Wittgenstein books. Such is obsession. So that's a kind of long-winded way of how I got interested in Wittgenstein.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. Yeah, I definitely relate in terms of like just methodologically with obsession. When you get into a subject that just really grips you, that you didn't expect to really come and grip you, it just sort of takes over in a life of its own. And then you're reading this book and this book and this book, and then you're just like, I want to read the whole secondary academic literature on this subject. I want to read everything
Yes.
that's obscure on it. I every footnote, everything, and it's just kind of just a fun nerding out. But yeah, thank
Yeah.
you for that, Michael. That's uh, really sophisticated and complex. Also, thank you for your clarity too, because I know sometimes, and I'll touch on this a little bit later, but I know sometimes when it comes to works of philosophy, the average person can be kind of daunted by it, especially when some philosophical writers are not as clear writers as others are, when they're
Yeah.
more obtuse or not. I remember when I first came, just my own reading in philosophy, I was kind of intimidated of Das Kapital. But once I started reading it and also watching supplementary lectures on it, I forget the professor's name, but he was going through Marx's Das Kapital, and that really helped. I was like, okay, this makes so much sense, and then I see why this is important and so forth. So,
Sure. Yeah.
yeah, just as a method, I always recommend that to anyone to like, don't be ashamed of, when you're starting out with stuff, don't be ashamed of like, Spark Notes or YouTube lectures clarifying.
Yeah.
Uh,
No.
more is better than less, basically.
Yeah, and don't be afraid to follow hunches when you're doing research or you have an interest.
Yeah.
Um, I can't tell you how many times I've been writing a paper where I've been doing nothing for 2 weeks straight, but reading and writing. And I have this like, I have this feeling like I need to go look at sources that focus it on this issue in this way more or
Mm.
that way. And I go follow that hunch and boom, source that kind of changes everything happens. And I find it
Yeah.
and I read it. I'm like, oh crap, like this. Okay. Now I see what's going on.
Yep.
Because there's so much literature out there, like your subconscious intuitive brain is probably processing things a little faster than you are consciously. And so if you have this intuitive sense of, I need this book, you might be right, follow it. You never know. It doesn't hurt. Worst case scenarios, it's just another source for your bibliography. Best case scenario, you end up are like, I am now obsessed and have all the books I can buy. And I wrote a thesis, like worst case, you just have another book. Best case, it becomes a lifelong passion.
Definitely. Yeah. And so I want to ask, next question here. Um, can you tell us a little bit about Wittgenstein's life or biography? I know from my own like just brief reading and sort of like watching philosophy lectures and stuff. From what I understand, he lived in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He fought in World War One. He was a lieutenant, which I think is interesting because there's other, Nietzsche was also a soldier as well, and he fought in the Franco-Prussian War and suffered some injuries and so forth, and was in the field hospital during the towards the end of the Franco-Prussian War. So it's interesting at seeing different philosophical writers that are experienced with war. The great Sun Tzu, of course, is a famous one. I mean, the art of war. So and
Yeah.
Saint Ignatius of Loyola was also a soldier.
Yeah.
So what can you tell us a little bit about his life and so forth?
Yeah. So, I mean, Wittgenstein's biography is it's quite convoluted. To be honest, like he is an extremely unusual individual.
Mm.
If any of your listeners are familiar with like Kierkegaard's biography and like the idiosyncrasies of Kierkegaard's personality, there's a lot of similarities in that kind of sense
Hmm.
between Kierkegaard and Wittgenstein. Like as people, they were very odd. They're bizarre, which is why they wrote the way they wrote and wrote to the extent they did. So before I get too deep, if your readers or listeners, sorry, want to read a biography of his, the best one is Ray Monk's. by the title of his name, Ludwig Wittgenstein. The subtitle, I believe, is The Duty of Genius. Yeah, and this is considered like one of the definitive, if not the definitive, biography on him.
Oh, okay, that's good to know.
It's excellent. Yeah, it's about like 600 pages, 650 pages. So I highly recommend that. So like kind of just like really broad overview of his life, because there's a lot, and there's probably things I'm going to leave out. So excuse my inability to remember everything. But he was born in Austria to a Jewish family. His father was very wealthy. I believe his father was involved in steel. He had several siblings. They were all highly gifted in various areas of the arts. Wittgenstein actually seems to be like kind of like the odd one out in some ways.
Oh, interesting.
Like he wasn't like musically talented per se, but like all of his siblings were, or artistically. He was more engineering and things of that nature. They were Jewish, and so they converted to Catholicism. Probably for like social reasons, not necessarily because of genuine belief, but he was baptized and raised Catholic, and that's very important actually for his later writings about like his Jewishness in say his book Culture and Value, or his struggle with Christianity as a religion throughout his writings that you would see. So he's an Austrian Jew raised Catholic essentially. Funnily enough, he actually went to grade school with Adolf Hitler.
Whoa, really?
Yeah, they actually, there's pictures. You can go look it up online. There's a picture of like the grade school like class, and like here's Wittgenstein and here's young Adolf.
I did not know that. That's
pretty weird.
Kind of, yeah, man.
It's a little weird. It's like I don't know what to make of that. I don't know if there's a reason that Hitler hated Jews because Wittgenstein beat the crap out of him in grade school. Like, who knows? I don't know. I don't know. But yeah, they went to school together, which is just weird. Wittgenstein's siblings, suicide is a big theme in his familial life. Several of his siblings committed suicide or attempted it, at least. Seemingly from like pressure from their father to perform at such a high level that was impossible to sustain. In their variety of areas of study or expression, whatever. I know that he went to study, I think in Cambridge. No, not in Cambridge. He was somewhere else. Wherever Frege was in the really early 1900s. We're talking like 1910s, something like that. Somewhere in there. He went and studied like aeronautics, I think it was.
Oh wow.
And like Gottlieb Frege just happened to be on like their philosophy department there, and he knew Frege. Like they were friends actually for the rest of Frege's life, I believe, if I remember properly. So like they were, and Frege was extremely influential on him. So he studied there, and he wanted to study philosophy, and for Wittgenstein it was a very like personal existential thing. Ray Monk gets into that a lot. I don't remember all the details, but I remember like it was like pretty severe like existential angst and anxiety over the issue of studying philosophy or not. And Wittgenstein was afraid that he wouldn't be good enough to study it, and so he went to Frege and asked Frege if he should study philosophy. Frege said, I don't know. Frege's a very old man at this point. Keep that in mind. So this isn't Frege being like an asshole. This is just
right.
He's old. He's probably like at this time he must be like in his 60s, 70s. So like and you have this young whippersnapper who's like 20 coming up to you like, should I study philosophy with like existential beads on his forehead? Like you're gonna be like, I don't know, kid. Like it's a natural response. So he tells him to go see Bertrand Russell in Cambridge. And Russell will tell you, is what he says. So Russell, he writes a letter of introduction to Russell, and for Wittgenstein, sends him off. Wittgenstein goes and kind of like doesn't enroll in Cambridge. He travels train and basically just like shadows Russell and his teaching in classes. And then eventually like there's a confrontation between the two of them, and Wittgenstein's basically have conversations and stuff, but like it gets to this point where Wittgenstein's like, should I study philosophy or not? This is why I came here to tell you. If you tell me I'm an idiot, I will become an aeronaut. If not, I will become a philosopher. That's like the quote that he said. It's just pretty like he's just a strange person. And so Russell said, write me something over the break and I'll tell you. He wrote him something over the break. Suppose we don't have this document, unfortunately. No one knows where it is. No one knows what it said. It's never talked about. But he wrote him this paper, and he gave it to Russell. Russell read the first sentence and said, "You're not an idiot. You should study philosophy."
Wow, just from the first sentence?
Yep.
Wow.
According to Ray Monk, yeah. So
Wow.
we don't know what that paper was or where it is, what said. We have no idea. No idea what it said.
Yeah,
I
wonder
really
if
sad. That would have been awesome to have that, but we don't have it.
Yeah, is there any recollection in anything that Russell wrote anything or
I have
about
no
it?
idea. If there is, it's buried, and we don't. It would be you'd have to go read the entirety of Russell's notebooks and journals at some
Yeah.
archive to find it, and who knows even then if it'd be reliable. Because
Gotcha.
Wittgenstein later also talks about how extensively he thought that Russell misunderstood him. So then there's also that issue.
Huh. Interesting.
So even if Russell had something, would it be good enough to base something off of? Maybe if it was just like a topical explanation, like this is what it was about, like a topic. Maybe, but long story short, what Russell didn't know was that during all this exchange, Wittgenstein was contemplating suicide.
Oh, wow.
And quite literally, Russell telling him not to be an aeronaut, but to study philosophy literally saved his life.
Wow.
Like he had plans to kill himself.
Was it because of lack of meaning or?
Yeah, to some extent, lack of meaning, purpose, this feeling that he couldn't follow a higher calling idea. There's a lot of things like that that are kind of just like smacked into him for some reason. I don't know where that comes from, but he just has it. It's this peculiar sense. He always felt alienated from the society and time in which he existed. And he talks a lot about that through his writings, especially Culture and Value, which is a translation and selection of notebooks of his.
Yeah.
So he starts studying there with Bertrand Russell and Moore at Cambridge. And then World War I starts. He's working on the Tractatus at this time already.
Oh,
doing
wow.
notes. Yeah, he's already been working on it for years. The Tractatus is really just a collection and reordering of comments made from his 1914 to 1916 notebooks. Yeah. So that's all it is. It's the 1914, 1916 notebooks. He takes the content, reorders it. We have the middle draft, which is the proto-Tractatus. You can get that, which shows where he starts adding like the numberings and stuff and changing their order, and we see his revisions. And then you have the Tractatus, which is the final version. So really cool textual genealogy there too. Really helpful. So he starts writing that. He goes and fights in World War I. He actually becomes in the trenches of World War I is where he finishes the Tractatus.
Wow.
So he finishes the Tractatus. Yeah, while he finishes it, the last sections are written while he's there in the trenches and as a POW.
Wow.
He becomes a POW, and I believe he goes to Italy for like 2 or 3 years as a POW. And it's in this context where he reads like Tolstoy's something about the gospel or something like that. Tolstoy's something, I don't remember. It's some mystical kind of writing from Tolstoy.
Gotcha.
And it was like really influential on Wittgenstein. That's kind of where like the mystical element comes in. And this is where we see this like entrance in the Tractatus at the end about like talking about the mystical and all that, which is in the notebooks early on and kind of all throughout. So like there is this, when he starts going to war, he has a shift in his personality, it seems, and perspective. He says like in his letter to one of his families, like, finally an opportunity for me to be a decent human being. And so like his perception of going to war was very duty filled in a sense. He saw a lot in that and went with a high intention of seeing his service as something of extreme value and significance, which is really interesting. And then after he got out as a POW, he tried to print the Tractatus. It was one of the longest processes to print a book I've ever heard about. It was rough. No one would translate it. No one would publish it. It took him years. And then finally in 1921, from 1918 to 1921 is how long he was trying to get it published. And he went basically to everywhere to try to get it published. And finally, a publisher agreed to publish it if Russell wrote an introduction to it. And then C.K. Ogden wrote the translation. And there was like exchange between Wittgenstein and Russell on Russell's introduction. Wittgenstein doesn't agree with Russell's interpretation that he gives in the introduction. And so there's a lot of significance for that in secondary literature for how to interpret the Tractatus, for example. But long story short, it got published. He came back to Cambridge, I believe, afterwards for some time. Not long. He couldn't stand it there. He didn't like it. And then he decided to give away all his money to one of his siblings. I mean, keep in mind, when I say all his money, I mean enough money for a man at that time to be financially independent for the rest of his life.
Oh, wow.
So like he was extremely wealthy, and he gave away all of his money to to save his family, I believe, from the Nazi party. Actually, the Nazis knew they were Jews, and they were like, "We'll let you go if you pay us money." And so they basically ended up like he forked out like all of his money to save his family. And then I think it was in particular like 2 sibling members that were caught by the Nazis. And so, but he like wanted to give it away. He didn't want the money. He didn't like having money. He hated that. So in many ways, like his personality is very ascetical. Like you can see probably influences from Catholicism that are probably unnoted because most people that read on him aren't Catholics. And so I think you could, if you wanted to, you could definitely maybe draw out some influence there in his perception of money and goods and things like that. He goes away to like the Netherlands or something like that, lives alone, like as a hermit for years, tries to be a school teacher, but is so frustrated by the students. He ends up like hitting one of them or something.
Oh my gosh.
Quits. I'm not kidding. Yeah. Like, and then he built a house. Yeah. And he spent time building a house for his sister because he was an engineering student. So he built a house, and like that's extensively studied to this day. Like
Isn't
the
that a museum?
architectural significance. I think it might be, yeah. The Wittgenstein house, something like that. Yeah, it might be a museum. Yeah, so like his life here has like this like period where it's just like he's doing all kinds of stuff, and it's like what?
Yeah.
And then he returns later. And he returns later to when is it? I'm gonna cheat. I'm gonna borrow
You're fine. Book. Quoting sources is welcome here.
Okay. Yeah, 1929 is when he comes back.
Okay.
So he publishes the Tractatus in 21 and then leaves, and then is gone till 1929.
Oh wow.
It's almost 10 years. He's not in Cambridge. He doesn't want anything to do with it. He hates it. Yeah, there's a famous quote. It's really funny about when he comes back. Well, God has arrived. I met him on the 5:15 train, which is one of his friends, Keynes, wrote this when he met Wittgenstein coming back in 1929. And so then that's when kind of Wittgenstein's like later period, quote unquote, starts happening. And then from there, he meets several people, has conversations, becomes friends, and produces another work to be written called, I think, Notes on Logical Form is what it's called, which is the only work published during his lifetime besides the Tractatus. And that was presented to like the Aristotelian Society in this period. I think it was in 29 actually.
Oh, nice! What a name too.
I think so. Yeah, Notes on Logical Form. He gave it to the Aristotelian Society in 1929. I think it was. It's actually a pretty interesting paper. You can get a hold of it usually in like there's a volume from Hackett called Philosophical Occasions by Wittgenstein. Okay. And it's included in there usually. It's actually sometimes a difficult piece to find. So that's a helpful anthology for people that are interested.
Oh, nice. Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm going to be listing all kinds of books. So
definitely. Yeah.
Put them in the description for people. So then he did that. And then I think he just stayed at Cambridge the rest of his life, and he died there of cancer. I think he was like 50, 51.
Oh, wow.
He wasn't old. He was young. Yeah, he was young. He died of I think it was colon cancer.
Gotcha.
He was living with Anscombe like the last like 10 years of his life. GM Enscombe and her husband Peter Yeach in Cambridge. And so it's also very interesting. Like, she was one of his students, one of his literary executors. The only female student he really associated with, or female person really, in any kind of like positive way. He didn't like. I mean, he had. Yeah, there's a lot of discussions about whether or not he was a homosexual, which I don't think is true. We know that he tried to be married, although his concept of romance seems interesting as well. Purely platonic, without any children. Again, a very ascetical person. I think the reason why people assume he was homosexual is because they don't have any way to understand like ascetic practices, like celibacy.
Right. Yeah.
I think Wittgenstein's Catholic influence probably would help curtail influences that he's homosexual. So I don't know, unless there's some evidence out there that's just pretty like, well, okay, there's no way around it. But as far as I haven't found anything like that. So yeah, that's just kind of an overview of his life. His later period starts in 29, 30-ish, 33. And he writes all kinds of notebooks, drafts for publication that never get published, and then dies. And the most edited, revised like thing that he has work is what is published as the Philosophical Investigations, basically immediately after his death.
Oh, wow.
Like very quickly. Yeah, his life and personality is very turbulent. Very turbulent individual, very odd. Eccentric is a perfectly fine word to describe him as. Yeah, that's just kind of like an overview of his life. Sorry that took a while, but
oh no, that's fine.
He has a weird, convoluted life. There's a lot in there that I missed too. So,
gotcha. Well, that's really good. You know, what I want this to serve for everybody is just a really good, meaty, thorough introduction, and then from the books you recommend to sort of function as a springboard to go into further research. So for for everyone to do for themselves. So yeah, thank you for that. And I have a few before I ask my formal questions that I had here on my, as I said in my episode with Dustin Quick the other day, my advanced iPhone 7. Yeah, it quote unquote. A few things came to mind when you were talking about his life. One was just an observation is it's interesting how religion plays into, and of course it just makes sense how it would play into someone's life, especially someone who's philosophical and thinking about the big ideas and existence and everything. But it's interesting that I notice another common theme is in Karl Marx. His dad, growing up, he was Jewish. And then his dad converted to Catholicism for more of like business reasons and sort of probably cultural reasons too, since Europe at the time, especially Germany, was mostly Catholic and Lutheran. And so, that makes sense. And at the time of, Marx's childhood, the modern state of Germany doesn't exist until after the Franco-Prussian War. So he's born Prussian in Prussia, and then eventually becomes Germany. But yeah, so that's interesting. And so one thing I wanted to ask you too was in some of the things you said. Do you think he felt estranged? I know you talked about this before, but do you think he felt estranged by women as like not relatable? Not saying again he's gay or anything, but do you think that because of the unrelatability he didn't have much approachment, or because of defeat? Because I know there's a similar theme in Nietzsche where he tries to propose several times to different women he's intimately loved with, and they all reject him, and it causes a deep depression in himself. Is there anything like that in him? I know you talked about it a little bit, but
to an extent, there's something there. I'm not sure to what extent that is, because we have Anscombe, and it wasn't a romantic relationship whatsoever.
Right.
But they are extremely good friends. Like he calls her the old man or something like that. Like it was a term of affection because Wittgenstein is often paraded and presented as being misogynistic by secondary literature. And he might have been to a certain extent. But I think also you have to keep in mind he's raised in a very traditional family.
Mm-hmm.
Right? He's raised Austrian Jewish, converted to Catholicism. Like, okay, so like his view of like familial life is extremely much shaped by that. Which,
Mm-hmm.
and then also clearly the like several attempts at suicide in his family shows some dysfunction.
Right.
Um,
Right.
and so I would just wager it stems from his dysfunctional family life when he was
Mm.
a child.
Yeah.
Um, and also he was probably a genius. Um, like an IQ genius. So I imagine
Oh,
that
yeah.
often comes with certain social inadequacies.
Mm.
Um, you know, that some people are able to overcome, and that doesn't bother them as much throughout their life. But for him, it seems that was a pretty significant factor. So with him, it's hard to tell because there's times where it just seems like his purpose for treating women in a certain way is kind of like ascetical.
Mm-hmm.
He'll describe it that way sometimes, but then other times he seems to like genuinely want some type of human companionship and relationship, but can't acquire it.
Hmm.
Um, it's just hard. It's hard to specify or determine. So I don't
Gotcha.
really know. I would want to read Monk's biography. If you read Monk's biography, you probably would have a better grasp on what the right answer to that question might be. But that's my guess.
Sure. Yeah, and thank appreciate that. It's very thorough. Um, you've partially in everything you've described, you've partially answered one of my next questions for you, and it is because my one of my next questions was Wittgenstein, was he religious? But that's clearly yes in terms of his background of being raised. But later on in life, did he still maintain a belief in God? Or did he become an atheist or skeptic or agnostic?
That's unanswerable.
Oh, really? What do you mean?
Yeah, like we don't know.
Huh?
No one knows. Like he talked about religion so much, um, and in a non-disparaging way. A lot of times, sometimes disparagingly, sometimes not. It seems he goes through moods and shifts throughout his life. But like he was never really like a part of an institutional organized religion or church. On his deathbed, I heard someone told me this. I haven't confirmed or denied this, so take that for what it is. Someone asked him if he believed in God, and I think he said like, "I tried to live as if I did," or something
Hmm.
like that. And so I'm not. But then again, I haven't verified that quote, so I don't know if that's verifiable. Um, what I do know is that his closest friend was a devout Roman Catholic philosopher, Anscombe, and her husband. Um, and he chose to live with them the last years of his life, and he died while he was living with them.
Hmm.
And that is one of his closest friendships in his later period is to this woman. And it's not sexual, it's not romantic. It seems to be some kind of genuine, pure friendship.
Hmm.
Um, and that's pretty significant. I don't think a lot of times I haven't seen people give that much credence.
Hmm.
Um, but that's pretty significant to me. Like I mean, Bertrand Russell, if he was put in this situation, would not live with Catholic.
Oh yeah, yeah,
Bertrand
yeah.
Russell was his mentor in a certain sense. So he's willing to live with this Catholic, and he's genuinely good friends with her
Hmm.
to the point where he believes she understands him enough, along with other people. There's 2 or 3 or 4 literary executors of his estate. But, anyways, she's one of them. And he notoriously does not have good relationships with women. He doesn't get along with women notoriously throughout his life. It's like a thing. And so the one genuine female relationship that seems to work very well that he has is with a devout Catholic woman. And he believes that she understands him along with his other friends and students, most of which are students, understands him enough to be a literary executor. And he gave her a affectionate nickname and so on and so forth. So I think like people don't like, I mean, you're who you decide to be at close friends with does suggest things about your leanings in certain ways.
Gotcha.
For example,
Yeah.
atheists who hang out with Christian friends because they like the morals that their Christian friends have
Hmm.
show that they value that something that's there.
Hmm.
Now,
Yep.
why does Wittgenstein choose to do this with Anscombe? I don't know exactly, but I think
Gotcha.
that's pretty significant. So his relationship with religion is a struggle. He struggles. He strives with religion. You see this a lot in Culture and Value, his notebooks. You see this just really throughout his writings, to be honest with you, where he talks about God, the meaning of life, religion, Calvinism, Protestantism, Catholicism.
Oh wow, I did not know
There's
that.
really, oh yeah, like he talks about like Pauline stuff in Culture and Value. Like I said, he's a really weird guy with a lot of really random stuff.
Yeah, very well read,
Um,
widely read, I was about to say. Yeah.
yes and no. Like he's weird. He's very he used to brag that he had never read Aristotle,
Huh. That's kind
but
of
he was
surprising.
an avid reader of Augustine and Plato.
Hmm. That's
He wasn't
interesting.
he is not a philosopher of historical sensitivity, which I think if you'll permit me,
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
in the preface to the Tractatus, he says, I do not wish to judge how far my efforts coincide with those of other philosophers. Indeed, what I have written here makes no claim to novelty in detail. And the reason why I give no sources is that it is a matter of indifference to me whether the thoughts that I have had have been anticipated by someone else. Sorry. I will only mention that I am indebted to Frege's great works and to the writings of my friend Mr. Bertrand Russell for much of the stimulation of my thoughts. No, not inspiration, stimulation.
Yeah, that's.
Um,
Huh.
and so, like already in the Tractatus, his earliest work, right? He's already eschewing historical sensitivity, which I think later ends up doing him harm. But he
Mm.
cares more about the ideas themselves than where they come from. And so for him, like he doesn't really care if it comes from XYZ source. Does it make sense? So for him, it's not super widely read. Like he's in, like Dostoevsky is someone he read clearly. He mentions him in the notebooks. Tolstoy he read. And we know he read Henry James. We know he read Plato. And we know he read Augustine. We know he liked Augustine, actually, despite the way that most people treat his passage of Confessions in the Investigations. He actually likes Augustine. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of sources that you could kind of acquire on his relationship with religion. A really good one that I like, actually, is Fergus Kerr's work on oneself. The subtitle being Wittgenstein's Philosophical Psychology. It's very helpful, but there's a chapter in here, Wittgenstein and Catholicism.
Oh.
And Fergus Kerr is a Catholic theologian, philosopher. He's a Dominican, actually. Fergus Kerr is awesome. I love Fergus Kerr. So Fergus Kerr has this book, and this chapter really kind of helpfully deals with these questions.
Nice. Okay. I haven't heard of him.
Oh yeah, you got to check out Fergus Kerr, dude. Fergus Kerr is awesome. There's another. This is a famous book by Fergus Kerr, Theology after Wittgenstein.
I have heard of that, actually. Yeah, Amazon has been recommending it to me for a while.
Yeah, so I actually haven't got a chance to read all of this yet, but this is an excellent volume which will kind of get you into his concepts of religion. I know there's another famous, Hilary Putnam in Renewing Philosophy has an article or a chapter in here on Wittgenstein on religious belief, which is super influential. So there's that. I'm just going to stack all the books that I refer to over here. That way I can send you a list when we're done. That way.
Sure. And just to interrupt you real quickly, go ahead, because this is a perfect transition, because my next question was actually twofold. Was what are his main works, and what are the main his main readers or interpreters, disciples, etc.
Like in secondary literature?
Yeah, secondary. But let's start with primary. Let's start with his own works. I know you mentioned the Tractatus and the Investigations. But I'm assuming after he died, and correct me if I'm wrong, I'm assuming after he died, his writings were collected and then published.
Yes, in a variety of ways. So this is the difficulty with Wittgenstein. It's really frustrating, actually, to be honest with you, as someone who likes to research and study people, or philosophers, I should say, not just people. People are boring. Philosophers are great. Yeah, excuse me. I'm sorry. His writings are never really like the collection and organization of his writings is pretty bad. I'm not gonna lie. So, for example, you have the investigations, right? Okay. It's basically the conglomeration of writings that have basically been around since 1933. It was published for the first time in like 50 something. I think it was 51. I think.
Trying to find that copyright.
Yeah, well, it's in the introduction. 53.
Okay.
1953. He died in 51 in April. Okay.
Okay.
So, but for example, there's a lot of content in here that is word for word throughout other notebooks, because that's actually where he consolidated it all into this. So
okay.
So for your listeners, if there's two books you want to read by Wittgenstein, read the Tractatus, read the Philosophical Investigations. Those are the two. Now, if you're a big nerd, right, and you're like, okay, I need to know the real stuff, right? Okay, then you would want to, if you want to understand like the Tractatus better, if that's where you're more interested, then you should pick up his 1914 to 1916 notebooks.
Oh, wow.
And these are like, literally, this is the source for the Tractatus. So, which I think is also really important interpreting the Tractatus is like, keep in mind, like, despite the impersonal tone of the Tractatus as a work, it's drawn from personal notebooks made half at Cambridge, half in war. These are personal notebooks. There's a lot of personal comments in these. And like, I mean, like here, there's a passage, where does he say? Like he says, what do I know about God and the purpose of life? That's a question that he has in 11/6/16. So November 6th of 1916. And that's this whole entry on like, what do I really know about the purpose of life, how I relate to the world, good and evil, God, meaning, praying, comparing God to a father, all these things. And it's like deeply personal and religious, and I'm not saying it's correct or incorrect. I'm just saying like the tone is very distinct, but we often forget in interpreting this that this came from this. So if you want to study the Tractatus more, pick up the notebooks. If you want to study the investigations more, there would be two works, I would say. Blue and brown books. These are not, so, okay, Wittgenstein, the only published works that he had in his lifetime were the Tractatus and Notes on Logical Form. These were basically typed from notes or dictations of lectures. These were typed up by students and then distributed around Cambridge.
Oh, okay. Oh.
And then that's what these are. So they're direct, like basically dictations from his lectures, put into book form. They're really, really good. And there are two distinct ones, the blue book and the brown book. And they kind of deal with slightly different questions and kind of studies. But the subtitle is Preliminary Studies for the Philosophical Investigation. So even the publishing acknowledges that this is a precursor to that. And then after that, I would recommend, this is probably the most influential on my interpretation of Wittgenstein, would be his Philosophical Grammar.
Ooh.
This was put together in 1933 from notebooks from 1930 to 1932. And this is, it really shows the development from his earlier period to his later period. And this is probably excellent. A lot of this, though, is parallel to remarks made in two other works. For example, his philosophical remarks, which is earlier than the philosophical grammar. This is 1930, this is 1933, so 3-year difference. This is very much, a lot of stuff in here is similar in here, but extrapolated more. And then also the latter half of philosophical grammar is elucidations or summaries of his remarks on the foundations of mathematics.
Oh, nice! Wow, that's yeah. I've often said I'm really bad at math, but I love the philosophy of math.
Yeah, philosophy of mathematics is amazing. So these would be like the works I'd recommend if someone wants to like really dig into Wittgenstein, like how to understand him. So those are like his primary works, but like, so like there's also other stuff where you have, for example, the latest notebooks that he has published into what we now call Uncertainty.
Okay.
Where he deals with G.E. Moore's transition to kind of common sense realism. And it's also very good. I haven't read the whole thing yet. But then there's also more like anecdotal works like Culture and Value, which are just random selections of notebooks from, I believe,
nice.
1929 to his death in 1951. But again, very selective. So this is like a mere fraction. Like, I mean, it's not a big book. It's a mere fraction of these notebooks. And so there's just a lot that's untranslated and a lot that is translated, but like the translation isn't super organized. Like a lot of content overlaps. So there's a lot of repetition. There's a lot of ambiguity about what relates to what and how. And it's a nebulous, honestly, it's a nebulous to get into. It takes a lot of time to find stuff and find where it fits into the puzzle of his writings.
Gotcha.
But once you do that, it's great because then you like actually have a really good framework for interpreting him. I honestly don't think enough of the secondary literature really gets into the like textual genealogy enough of his works to properly interpret him. I think we make a lot of mistakes because of that. Okay, so you asked me about primary sources, and then you wanted me to talk about like his students, like secondary literature.
Yeah, his students, his interpreters, and which I guess would be commensurate with the secondary literature.
Okay. Okay, so like students he had were like Rush Rees, G.E.M. Anscombe, Peter Geach. There were others. His immediate students, to be honest, use him in very interesting ways. Geez, it's really hard to get into it because it's such a crazy field. Like there's all kinds of trajectories that you find in interpreting Wittgenstein. So let me put it this way. Okay, this will be a better way to approach it. I'm just going to lay out for you like the two groups of interpretation with respect to the relationship between the early and later writings, and that will kind of give you lay of the field a little bit for the most part. So you have what's called the traditional interpretation or the traditionalist interpretation. This would be people like, I believe Anscombe fits into it, although I might have to reconsider that. That seems to be debated a little bit at the moment. So I found some more material on it, and now I'm reconsidering my interpretation there. Hold on, I'm trying to find it. Okay, so then you have Hans Johann Glock. He's a very famous Wittgensteinian scholar. I'm not sure if he knew Wittgenstein directly, but he did the Wittgenstein Dictionary with Blackwell.
Oh, okay. Oh, nice. Blackwell, yeah.
Helpful. Very helpful, although his interpretive method and scheme is very clear in his interpretation and definitions. And so sometimes I think he's incorrect, but whatever.
Okay.
So people like him, PMS Hacker, Peter Hacker. I don't think I actually have a book by Peter Hacker. Most of his are hard to get a hold of.
Did he work with computers? Sorry.
Oh my gosh. No, he did not work with computers. A really famous interpreter is also Saul Kripke on rules and skepticism, I think, or something like that. which is a really famous, but that's an interpretation of later works.
Okay.
So you have this traditional school, and then there's a lot of figures that fit into that. It's more like a spectrum of interpretation. And then you have what's called the New Wittgenstein, which would be people like Cora Diamond. Let me pull out this book. This is probably the best expression of it. Well, actually, no. The New Wittgenstein comes from this volume from Routledge, edited by Alice Carey and Rupert Read, I think. And so this suggests reconsidering the continuities and discontinuities between the early and later writings that is commonly presented in the traditionalist school. So people like Cora Diamond, Alice Carey, Edmund Dane, others. And there's a huge list of names there that would take me like a while to go into. Like Usur Akari, Anne-Marie Sorengard Christensen, Paul Johnson, Benjamin de Measle, although I think he's more on the traditionalist side of certain interpretive issues. Mary McGinn, or McGinn, sorry. And there's Italian guys doing stuff, whose names I will not try to pronounce. Anthony Kenny is a famous interpreter. Yeah, there's just so many. It's interesting. You'd be surprised how many disparate philosophers write on or influenced by him without realizing it. Without you realizing their influence.
Gotcha.
So my interest in Wittgenstein has always been in terms of like the application of his philosophy or his thought to moral philosophy or his moral philosophy, which is different claims and are debated claims. But nonetheless, that's kind of where I've been at. So there's also interpretive school that kind of wants to look into compatibilities between Wittgenstein and the Aristotelian or Thomistic tradition. Marco de Mont, he's at University of Genoa. Roger Poivet, he wrote after Wittgenstein, St. Thomas. I can't find my copy. It's somewhere around here. And then there's other guys too doing work there. Anscombe, people suggest Anscombe as being one of them. Roger Teichmann is another guy. Anthony Kenny is another one. Fergus Kerr is another one. Possibly G.H. von Wright as well in this group. And G.H. von Wright, that's significant because he was one of Wittgenstein's literary executors. So the difference between the traditionalist and this new school is the traditionalist school wants to put a heavy dichotomy between the early and late writings. So the Tractatus period and the post-Tractatus period are characterized by discontinuity.
Gotcha. Okay.
That's their interpretation. This is also commensurate with interpretations about the place of ethics in the Tractatus. So, for example, the traditionalist school generally is the ineffabilist translation, which is the idea that they emphasize the distinction between saying and showing in the Tractatus, and then say that the purpose of ethics is to show or gesture towards ineffable truths of ethics, religion, value, etc. And that's the ineffabilist translation. The New Wittgenstein wants to argue against the ineffabilist interpretation and the discontinuity between the early later writings. And then, of course, that, just like the traditionalist school, is definitely a spectrum of interpretations rather than one set of readings. It's very disparate. And so secondary literature is basically a free-for-all. Like, I mean, it's a mess. Like, I mean, I don't mind it in a certain sense, because there's a lot of different disparities that you can work with, and interpretive debates to be had that are very interesting and allow a lot of insight into his writings. And I think there are some that have clear superiorities and clear disadvantages. For example, I like the New Wittgenstein school because of the emphasis on continuity. I think that's kind of self-evidently correct if you read his writings and just kind of read about his biography. Like, he doesn't change very much as a person at all throughout his life, hardly at all. And his approach to like issues and culture and stuff are very similar throughout his life. And you would expect such an intense philosophical change, like is claimed by the traditionalist school, to correspondingly cause a difference in life. And also, like, this the new Wittgenstein school wants to see more of his anti-theoretical tendencies that you find in the investigations to be found in the earlier writings, so on and so forth, stuff like that. So personally, I think Anthony Kenny is a really nice middle ground between the two schools, even though I think even Anthony Kenny sometimes is too emphatic on the discontinuity. But a good book from him would be this Wittgenstein revised edition from Blackwell again.
Oh, nice. Okay.
This is a really good book. So, yeah, I mean, I'm sorry I can't be more detailed with secondary literature. It's just...
No, you're fine.
It's such a nebulous area of scholarship. Like, I can find stuff that is just like, what? Like, it just, like, for example, I can find stuff that will interpret the Tractatus as being like neo-Schopenhauerian. Because Schopenhauer was an influence. So, and his primary interaction with Kant is through Schopenhauer. But but Wittgenstein doesn't believe in the legitimacy of suicide. So there's this.
That's interesting.
Yeah, like that's what I'm saying. Like, it's really weird. Like, interpreting Wittgenstein and secondary literature on him is really difficult because of these. There's just, the man didn't care where he took from, he just took.
Yeah.
And so because of that, it's like, what? How am I supposed to interpret like these influences? How am I supposed to mesh them together? You know, I mean, it's just hard to really get into it and grab. You just kind of start somewhere and then go from there. Honestly, like a good companion to kind of dealing with a lot of the like disparities between primary and secondary literature would probably be like the Oxford Handbook on Wittgenstein's good. They got a lot of different perspectives and views presented, and you can kind of get an idea of what's going on. Yeah, it's nebulous field. Like yesterday, I was just reading an article by Anne Marie Sorengard Christensen. She teaches at University of South Denmark. There was an article in this book called Wittgenstein's Moral Thought by Rashif Agam Segal and Edmund Dane from Routledge. I think this was published in like 2018, so it's very recent. Like a lot of this stuff is very 2019 is the first paperback. 2018 is the first edition.
Oh yeah, so that's pretty recent stuff.
Yeah, a lot of this stuff is like going on right now. It's been going on since the 2000s. So the new Wittgenstein school really starts in 2000. That's when this book was published.
Oh, okay.
And that's when you start really seeing this debate, and it's been going on ever since. So now it's 20 years later.
Yeah.
21 years later, we're still having the same debate about interpreting him.
Yeah.
But anyways, I just read this article about her views on arguing about how to apply Wittgenstein to debates about particularism and the status of moral theory, stuff like that. And there was like all kinds of sources that she was referring to in her footnotes and bibliography that I didn't realize they used Wittgenstein and were like comported, like positively adding to the contribution of secondary literature, trying to borrow, because much of Wittgenstein's secondary literature really isn't what did Wittgenstein say. It's okay, Wittgenstein seems to do these kinds of things. How do we take this method or this approach or these ideas and reapply them? Honestly, a lot of Wittgensteinian secondary literature is that way. That's why I suggest Kenny, because he kind of will give you like the overview of Wittgenstein himself as a person, his philosophical approach, his ideas, and then you can from there go into that other literature. Otherwise, you might be a little lost. But yeah, so it's just a nebulous field, and you can kind of find anything that you want because there's such a varied interpretational world out there of his thought. It's hard. It's really hard. So that's what I would say about secondary literature, which is a really long digression into essentially, I don't know how to explain this to you. Too much. It's just too much.
No, that's great. And it's funny because it seems like a very I've noticed, at least in some German authors I've read, both religious and non-religious, that and it's not exclusive to them, of course, but methodologically a lot of them are very much like Renaissance men that draw from so many sources and incorporate it and synthesize it into their work. Nietzsche is like that, and Ratzinger, from the works I've read of his,
Yeah.
now Benedict the 16th Emeritus, a lot of his stuff is like that. And then old an old Prussian German cardinal back in the 19th century during Vatican I, Hergenrother, he was like that with his, and he was a philologist and canonist and church historian and cardinal. So it's interesting how, like, methodologically, a lot of them use it. And again, other people of other nationalities and ethnicities, of course, do this too. But
Sure.
it is interesting how there is a very sort of machine laser finesse mind. People have commented on Joseph Ratzinger that some people have called him the German machine mind because of how, like, analytic and just precise he is, was and is, even in old age too, which is pretty interesting. So before I ask some of my formal questions that I have just some brief questions that came to my mind as you were talking. One of them is with Wittgenstein. I know people dispute whether or not, like, the Myers-Briggs or the personality types are valid or whatever. I personally think there's a lot of legitimacy to that, or how at least the followers of Jung and his disciples, how they propagated or whatever, versus Jung himself and all that. But what do you think, like, personality type on the Myers-Briggs Wittgenstein would be?
I've actually looked this up before. I'm pretty sure it's INFJ.
Really? That's actually kind of surprising.
Yeah, INTJ or INFJ.
Okay. Wow.
He definitely is an introverted intuitive.
Yeah, I was about to say that's. I almost thought he would have been
moody,
like
his moodiness, yeah.
Yeah, I almost thought he would have been like an INTP, just from what I mean, I haven't read as much as you have, but that was like my impression when I saw the.
Yeah, he's hard, man. He's really hard to, like, pin. I've seen people argue INFP. I've seen people argue INTP, INTJ, INFJ. I would say probably INFJ, INFP, or INFJ, INF, or INTJ. Sorry.
Gotcha.
INTJ, INFJ. Don't know. He's gotcha. Weird cookie.
Smart cookie, weird cookie. Yeah. So another question too. This is just, again, when you were talking, this came up to my mind. Going back early in his life when he served in the military, was he despite feeling alienated from the culture in Austria-Hungary, do you think was he still very patriotic and sort of, like, because you mentioned about, like, duty and so forth.
I'm not sure if it was per se to his country. That's possible. I'm not sure. Yeah, I mean, he definitely went. I mean, when the war happened, he went and fought for Austria as Austria. He volunteered. He wasn't drafted. Like he very willingly went. So I'm sure you could infer from that a level of patriotism. Like, I mean, I wouldn't go fight for a country that I hate.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Like, nah, they can go die. Like, I can stay here in England and be safe.
Mm-hmm.
You didn't do that.
Yeah.
So I would say, to a certain extent, you probably have to derive some kind of patriotism. At least the simple kind of, this is where I'm from and I want it to be safe.
Yeah.
But his duty his duty sense that he has in going to the war seems more generic. Almost generic in the way that, like, a Christian might describe the will of God for their life, right? It's like very generic sense of, like, purpose and duty that you have to follow these things. I think I would make it analogous to something like that. That's how I'd want to say it. So.
Gotcha. Yeah. So I love one of my side hobbies is I really love, the history of Europe in the 20th century, especially anything World War One or World War Two related, and Cold War and stuff too. I've always loved reading that type of stuff. And
Yeah,
so yeah, where was he? Where was Wittgenstein during the Second World War? Since, of course, in '33 Hitler rose to power, and even before then, in the '20s, you had the Nazi Party in Germany, and then
Cambridge, as far as I know.
oh, Cambridge. Okay,
I'm pretty sure he was in England. Like, I know he went and made trips to Austria to see family and other places in Europe, but for the most part, I believe he was in the UK. I could be wrong though, but I don't know much about his later biography as I do his earlier.
gotcha.
So I could be mistaken, but I would venture to say the majority of his time was in Cambridge in his later period.
Gotcha. Okay. And so one of my next questions for you um, is, what do you think his? I guess by some of the secondary literature you've mentioned, written by Dominican, I guess this would be a yes. But one of my question is his thought? But I haven't read his book either. But is Wittgenstein's thought compatible with Christian theism or any type of theism?
um, how do I want to put this? This is a tricky one. Wittgenstein's thought is compatible with theism insofar as a hammer is compatible with putting a nail in a wall.
Oh, okay. Expand.
Yeah, let me explain that a little bit. So Wittgenstein's approach in many ways eschews positive constructivist conceptions of philosophy. His method is much more therapeutic in a certain sense. And so his methodology, especially in the later writings, isn't so much about proposing theses in philosophy. In fact, he explicitly denounces that.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
It's more so showing showing the fly the way out of the bottle is what he says in the Investigations. Or it's in Culture and Value somewhere here. I have it. I have my paper here.
Paper.
The real discovery that I heard this. The real discovery is the one that enables me to break off philosophizing when I want to. The one that gives philosophy peace so that it is no longer tormented by questions which bring itself into question. There is not a single philosophical method, though there are indeed methods, different therapies, as it were. What is your aim in philosophy? Question mark. To show the fly the way out of the fly bottle. He says that in the Investigations. And then elsewhere, he says, thoughts that are at peace. That's what someone who philosophizes yearns for. A philosopher is a man who has to cure many intellectual diseases in himself before he can arrive at the notions of common sense. Nearly all my writings are private conversations with myself. He says in Culture and Value. So his concept of what he's doing is definitely more so deconstructive in that sense, not deconstructive in the sense of Derrida.
Right.
I mean, he's approaching problems, and his goal is to dissolve them, not solve them. Because he believes that the very problem is itself a symptom of a deeper problem. And the only way to solve the deeper problem is to show you that there is a deeper problem and then dissolve these other tertiary.
Oh, interesting.
Problems.
Huh.
And as someone who's kind of buys into MacIntyre's kind of approach to modern moral philosophy, as someone who buys into Charles Taylor's ideas about the origins of secularity in modern society, as someone who kind of gets that, I have a modern, anti-modern, modern, pre-modern kind of dichotomy in my mind, which I think is very justifiable from the literature. There's definitely some sympathies I have deeply with him. A good book on this kind of stuff would be, even though I don't agree with everything in it, would be Kevin Cahill's The Fate of Wonder.
Oh, okay.
Wittgenstein's critique of metaphysics and modernity. And this is where he attaches modern metaphysics or Western metaphysics and modernity, and argues that Wittgenstein's critiquing this as early as the Tractatus and on throughout his later life. I don't necessarily agree with the extension of Wittgenstein to critiquing the entirety of metaphysics. Although there is evidence in Wittgenstein's writings that is what he's doing. For example, he says things like the entirety of my philosophical method. Where does he say it? Here, hold on. Let me find it. I want to make sure that I properly cite this. But it's also not conclusive. That's the problem with a lot of his stuff. He goes just back and forth in many ways between what you would hope him to be. He's just not clear. That's the problem. He's really not that clear at what he needs to be.
And if you don't mind, also give the page number too, just for reference for everyone.
Yeah, sure. Philosophical Investigations, paragraph 116. What we do is bring words back from their metaphysical to their everyday use. And so he says stuff like this, but then later in the investigations, I don't remember exactly where, he says that essence is expressed in grammar. And he'll make points which are like not anti-metaphysical. And because of his lack of historical sensitivity, I wonder very strongly if when he says metaphysical, what he means is Frege, Russell, Moore, their concepts of metaphysics, and not actual Aristotelianism. I wonder about that a lot because you see tendencies from him to Anscombe that I think kind of pull this out. So, for example, in the Tractatus, there's a passage in, I think it's 6.422, where he talks about like consequentialism, but he doesn't call it consequentialism. He says, what's the purpose of the ethical law? Thou shalt not blank, right? And he says, clearly, ethics isn't about reward and punishment in the ordinary sense. And then he says at the end of that passage, even though the question about the consequence of the action isn't exactly what ethics is talking about, he says there must be something right about the question we posed, which is, what if I don't do this command, thou shalt or thou shalt not? What if I don't do it, right? And he says that question, what if I don't do it? There's something right about it. There must indeed be some kind of ethical reward and ethical punishment, but they must reside in the action itself. And then if you go look at Anscombe's famous essay, Modern Moral Philosophy, what is her chief target? Is consequentialism. So I see influences between this and Anscombe, and I wonder if the problem is just his lack of historical sensitivity. And that kind of leads him to go a little too far, a little too excessive. Especially because we know that like predominant aims of like the predominant opponent that he's aiming at attacking is scientism. Like logical positivism, A.J. Ayer.
Okay.
Like he despises that stuff.
That's good to know. I like that. Makes him. Yeah, that makes me like him more.
Like he says in Culture and Value, there's this really cool passage. Talks about like this one guy who talked about like the difference between primitive and non-primitive ways of thinking and stuff. And he just wrecks this dude. He's just like, dude, basically just like, you're the one making primitive assumptions about primitives, about what you call primitive people. It's such a good passage, dude. Where is it? Oh, it's so sad when I can't find this.
I was about to say, play the Jeopardy music.
I know, right? Oh, come on.
While you're pulling that up, I'll just say one thing that came to my mind while you were reading the quote about his views on metaphysics, or at least I inferred from that passage that, it made me, in my own mind, it made me wonder, like, oh, is he kind of taking an anti-metaphysical sense? But then you made the nuance and distinction about it's unclear whether or not he means metaphysics and sort of like, the Platonic Aristotelian Thomistic tradition, or if he means really like Russell and other more very modern Anglo philosophical writers in the West during. I mean, writer. I mean, that's very massive difference because of. I mean, modernity for one, but then also just how far into modernity Russell is, and so forth. And it's also just interesting that before, I know you said this before, but I didn't know that Russell even knew Wittgenstein. That's an interesting. That is really interesting because Russell. I need to read more of Russell. It's been a while. I've read parts of his "Why I'm Not a Christian" and things of that nature,
Yeah.
and so forth. But I've always found Russell to be. I don't want to get off of this too much because we're talking about Wittgenstein, but I've always found it to be a bit just too reductionistic to me for my taste.
Welcome to the primary target of Wittgenstein's later philosophy is reductionism.
Oh, hey. Well,
like I'm literally not kidding. Like,
oh no,
like,
yeah.
Yeah. So like, okay, I found it. It's in
Oh, good.
Culture
good.
and Value, page 5E. It's a bilingual edition, so 5E just means the English page for 5.
Gotcha.
He talks about how like we view primitive people incorrectly, and he talks about how, as a matter of fact, we might assume something like this, though not that they, referring to the people of Israel. It's a book called Renan's People of Israel. I believe it's in French. They give the French title. Though not that they became aware of these things for the first time, but that they should do, that they do suddenly start to wonder at them. But this again has nothing to do with their being primitive, unless it is called primitive not to wonder at things, in which case the people of today are really the primitive ones. And Renan himself too, if he supposes that scientific explanation could intensify wonderment, as though lightning were more commonplace or less astounding today than 2,000 years ago. Aristotle I'm sorry, I'm reading my notes. Man has to awaken to wonder, and so perhaps do peoples. Science is a way of sending him to sleep again. In other words, it is just false to say, of course, these primitive peoples couldn't help wondering at everything. Though perhaps it is true that these people did wonder at all things around them. To suppose they couldn't help wondering at them is a primitive superstition. It's like supposing that they had to be afraid of all the forces of nature, whereas we, of course, have no need to be afraid. There's your Feuerbach reference, right? And he just kind of goes on. And I just think like this isn't something I found in secondary literature. My suggestion about reading between metaphysics per se and historical development of modern metaphysics. I have not read that. I got that suggestion and that idea from actually Anscombe, which is why I find it valid to apply to him because she's his student. He shaped her a lot. And in her book, Human Life, Action, and Ethics, it's a collection of essays from the St. Andrews studies in Anscombe. There's this article, Analytic Philosophy and the Spirituality of Man, where she argues about the place of substance dualism in contemporary analytic philosophy when she writes this. I believe 1979 is when this was given. And she argues that essentially what's happened is substance dualism, or the idea of there being an immaterial substance, which is the soul,
right,
has been alienated from its original sources, associated with a source that is actually antagonistic to those original sources. And then that new association has been critiqued and then rejected. And so then the fourth assumption is that because we reject this, we reject the original sources from which this idea comes. Apply that to Descartes.
Yeah,
He does. I find that remarkably similar to the way MacIntyre approaches things in After Virtue, where he talks about the concept of morals, virtues, and just what is moral philosophy and the grounds of morality and all these other things, and the project of justifying morality and the Enlightenment. Like that whole project, that whole idea, I find a lot of parallels between this and what MacIntyre is talking about. And I think that if Wittgenstein was exposed to that, it could have done him a lot of good, perhaps, but he wasn't. And so this is where it's like Wittgenstein may not actually agree with the way I'm going to end up reading him, but I think it actually makes him more sensical and a little bit more usable. And also, I don't see a reason why not to suggest that. We know his primary opponents were people who were of influence to him. Aristotle never was, because he never read them. So you can't say that he rejects Aristotelian metaphysics. He never read Aristotelian metaphysics, at least not Aristotle's Aristotelian metaphysics. And the metaphysics he was exposed to were Bertrand Russell's reintroduction of David Hume, essentially.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah.
So it's like when you see this critique, it's like, what is he specifically critiquing? I feel there's a big problem in Wittgensteinian secondary literature, which is one, too much emphasis on the historicization and dichotomy of or periodization. Like we put his works into periods too much. I think that's a problem. It doesn't allow for enough continuity and textual genealogy to occur. And so therefore we isolate the source from its actual, the text from its source, and then misinterpret it. And then the other issue is a lack of historical sensitivity to his own historical situations and what he's historically critiquing. Too often, because he's an analytic philosopher in a certain sense, and the majority of people who interpret him are analytics, we don't look into the historical setting with which he's engaging a lot of times and just extrapolate the idea from it and then just put it on the whiteboard and see what we can do with it. And it's led to some pretty bad things, I think, in philosophy. But I don't think it's his fault. I think it's just interpreters not being willing to ask the question, is he really critiquing metaphysics as a totality, or is he critiquing the metaphysics that he finds in XYZ philosopher?
Mm-hmm.
And that question has not been asked. It's a dumb reality, but it hasn't been asked in secondary literature, at least not that I can find.
Yeah, that is interesting, and it just goes to show you how, as one reads more in just whether it's linguistic philosophy or just general principles, how one word, the assumed meaning is not the meaning necessarily from one person to the other. And it's really difficult, especially in context in philosophy and theology, where the meaning of words matters, because it's really determinative. Because in reading Nietzsche, he's very clear what he means by metaphysics, because he's read Aristotle, he's read Plato, he's read Thomas, he's read Jerome. And so when Nietzsche says, I reject metaphysics, it's, I don't know if it was
this specific thing.
Yeah, it's very clear. I don't know if it was Nietzsche in particular or another commentator of his, but some secular writer or someone sympathetic to Nietzsche or Nietzsche's thought said basically that actually, I think it was Voltaire. Voltaire actually said that Aristotle is a tool for the Pope, and Nietzsche actually took that kind of line seriously with regards to Catholicism and metaphysics and natural law and things like that. And it's funny because I'll just say this because I don't want to go too much on Nietzsche. That could be a whole nother show we could do. But it's funny how Nietzsche is really harsh on most Christian and theistic writers, but even Jesus, even our Lord himself, he's very critical of, and says very, from a Catholic perspective, very blasphemous things. But then he praises Thomas. He actually, even though he disagrees with Thomas, he said he's the most congenial and kind towards him. So he's kind of left. It's been a while since I've read it, but from what my recollection is, it's basically because I think methodologically, Thomas is such a refined thinker and careful thinker that that's something that Nietzsche really he sees admired, and kind of, he doesn't say it in so much words, but almost as if in his view Aquinas kind of encapsulated or was sort of striving towards being an Ubermensch, even though he had different categories of his own that would reject those types of things. But that's just my personal interpretation. I haven't read any secondary literature on that, but from what I could gather, my own impressions and stuff was sort of that Nietzsche had a very high respect of Aquinas, and didn't devalue him, even though he attacked metaphysics, and even though, of course, Aquinas is so metaphysical.
Yeah.
No, he's actually more kinder to him than he is Jesus. So, but
Dang. Okay.
yeah, especially in
Huh.
especially in gay science and Beyond Good and Evil. Beyond Good and Evil, he goes after Christianity, slave morality and all that. But anyway,
Yeah.
one of my next questions was, and you've answered this in part. I was going to say, what type of philosopher was Wittgenstein? You said he was an analytic philosopher. Is that is there any debate about that?
Yes and no.
Okay.
Like, the subject matter that he tends to look into is what predominates analytic philosophy, but I believe his attitude and mode of approaching the subject is not analytic. I don't. He draws a lot from the Continentals. So there's a lot of literature comparing him and Heidegger, for example, which is like Continental philosophy par excellence with Heidegger, and then Wittgenstein having intense similarities. There was a time in the Philosophical Remarks, he described his project as like providing a phenomenology of language for a time. And so there's like overlap here between him and Continental schools that's often neglected. So I would say he doesn't really fit into either of them. He really doesn't fit anywhere. And that kind of fits. There's a passage where he says like the philosopher is no citizen of any community of ideas.
Huh, interesting.
I honestly see Wittgenstein very much as a Socratic character in some ways in the history of philosophy. A philosopher of new beginnings, and he's very much not willing to be tied down into schools of thought, and he's very much just kind of going with it. And I think you see that even at the beginning, where in the preface to the Tractatus, right, that quote I read earlier, where he's just kind of like, it doesn't matter where it comes from.
Right.
Essentially,
Yeah.
like, I don't really care.
Yeah.
I think you see that very strongly, where he's just like, yeah, I'm going to do what I'm going to do. And, the philosophy is an activity into which individuals must enter. It's not a group of ideas that you must espouse. And that's where like his positive conceptions of what is he doing, what is philosophy really come in, and he starts to attack things, which I don't necessarily think is incompatible with a Thomistic perspective. I'm actually working on writing stuff on that right now.
Oh, nice.
For my blog, I'm working on a couple articles on how do I show and how do I explain Wittgenstein's like more therapeutic or methodologically sensitive idea of philosophy as an activity with more like substantial constructivist concepts that you'd find in Thomism and things like that. It's difficult, but nonetheless, like, I don't see an entire dichotomy or a reason, why philosophers can't use him in general. Like, if you're not going to borrow from him positively, he's an excellent conversation partner, because he will provide you very interesting and unusual objections that are quite keen at times, and helpful. So, yeah, honestly, I don't understand how I got here with him, but I am here now, and
yeah,
it's a
labor of love.
Interesting place. It's an interesting place to be, because it's often seen as antagonistic to Thomism. In some ways it is, or at least some ways secondary literature is, I would say. Secondary literature definitely is. I'm not sure if the secondary literature properly represents Wittgenstein. And then even if it does, it's just like, okay, well, sometimes he's wrong. Like, just because you like a philosopher doesn't mean they're always right. Aristotle's wrong because matter is eternal and the world's eternal in him. That's not true. And I love Aristotle. St. Thomas, there's some stuff that's not correct. It's simple. So I mean, if we can approach people like that, I don't see a reason why we can't at least borrow and reapply ideas from a figure like Wittgenstein. So getting back into like, what philosophical school does he belong into, or is he an analytic? Is he Continental? I would say Wittgenstein is the gadfly philosopher of the 20th century. He will bother and annoy everyone. and his purpose is not to be limited by a school. So that would be my answer to that question.
Yeah, and follow up with that. My follow up to that is: has anyone in the secondary literature ever read him as an existentialist because of some of the things he grappled with in life, or as an idealist at all, or no? Is it just purely analytic?
Yes, in the influence with Schopenhauer, that's where you'll find stuff like that.
Gotcha. Okay, and that would make sense too.
Yeah. So, for example, there's an article in this book, Understanding Wittgenstein, by Godfrey Vesey, Vesey, I think is how you would pronounce that. There's a chapter in here. There it is. By Philip Griffiths, Wittgenstein, Schopenhauer, and Ethics, which kind of gets into like the influence of Schopenhauer and Kant.
Okay.
Which would kind of push you in that direction. There's actually a really interesting article about that in this book. It's new, The Darkness of This Time: Ethics, Politics, and Religion in Wittgenstein.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
And the article is in here by this guy named Benona Ramon Camara. He wrote, he edited this book by a subdivision of Springer on Wittgenstein and Plato.
Okay.
But in this, he has an article on Wittgenstein and the Platonic idea of the good, and basically argues for a strong ascetical interpretation of Wittgenstein's early conception of ethics, which is like very, I've never run across something quite like this. I read this like last week. I was like, oh, I just found this book like a month ago. That's the thing. There's so much literature. It was published 2015, but there's just so much literature, and it's still current, that it's like in the past 3 years, there's probably been, just on like Wittgenstein and ethics, not just Wittgenstein in general, Wittgenstein and ethics, there's probably been like 5 books published by different authors, all of whom are in debate with one another.
Okay, hang on one second. Just getting my charger here.
No, you're good. So because of that, it becomes difficult to where was I going with this? Where were we? I was talking about interpretive schools, and you asked about like existentialism. So
yeah, or an idealist.
Like idealism, like in like an Enlightenment sense of that term, and or like
in the German idealist type of sense. If
that there's a good bit of literature on his influence from German idealism.
Gotcha.
You could find that in any companion book, basically. So yes, there is a definite sense of influence there. A lot of people want to see him as calling the idealist realist debate like a false dichotomy, and wanting to go beyond that debate in many ways. It's interesting literature. Some of it's really weird, some of it's really good, some of it's just kind of dumb. I don't know. It's like I said, it's a world unto itself.
Yeah. Yeah, it is amazing just how I find it interesting how even just hearing you talk about it, and I know this is just a universal principle about how secondary literature on any field can really go in so many directions depending on the different perspectives that are offered and where they're coming from and when they're writing in history. And just in my own reading and stuff, and I'll do future videos on this myself, is just like in reading in the last few years a lot of books on the history and theology of the papacy, just all the perspectives and how different, even recent scholarship, there's just constant stuff. I'm actually, I'm reading a more modern work on it right now by an Orthodox theologian, a Greek Orthodox theologian, surveying 19th century through 20th century Greek Orthodox thought on the papacy. And this just came out like in 2019 or something. So it's like, it's really exciting how just like secondary literature and scholarship is just always it's always going and it's always going, and it's just fascinating. I love it. It's like it's really enriching. So it's like whatever one chooses to get involved with or passionate about, it's like there's just going to be so much, and it's just constant. Sometimes it can kind of feel exhausting because it's like, oh my gosh, so much reading, but then it's also like, yay, reading. But yeah.
It could definitely be one of those things where you're like, I just want to die and be home, please.
Take me home.
No.
Country road.
Country roads.
But yeah,
and you're like, not yet. I'm not ready.
Yeah, I'm not ready. No, it's like that. It's like that meme where it's like the hand on the button. It's like, take it back. I said go back.
back.
But
yeah,
anyway,
no, that's generally life.
Yeah, here on my channel, I like to incorporate humor with theology and philosophy. So, but one thing, so
only nihilistic humor though. Any other type of humor is not
or here's a joke: only nihilistic humor. Everything else is meaningless.
Yes.
Irony. But
yes.
my follow up. One of my follow up questions. I know you touched on this earlier. But can you explain how? Hang on, let me go up. I want to find the exact words that I wrote. So how have Catholics or other Christians responded to Wittgenstein? I know I asked you before if his thought was compatible with theism, but how have different Christians, and then also your own thought in working into this? I know you mentioned a little bit before, but could you talk more on that about Wittgenstein?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a lot there. Fergus Curtis' book called After Thomas, Versions of Thomism. There's developed schools like Wittgensteinian Thomism.
Oh, interesting. I did not know that.
Yeah, like there's a lot of weird stuff out there, dude, where you're like, what? Like you would not expect it, but it exists. And you're like, okay. So how would most of the literature I've read on him is not written by per se Christians. As far as I'm aware, at least. So the ones that I have read that are Christians, like Fergus Kerr, what I have read about them is they're very much appreciative. They want to draw from him what they can and understand the limits of that. For myself, it's like I look at him more like I'm a philosopher, and so I'm looking at him as a philosopher, and that's where I feel a lot of camaraderie and respect. And I borrow a lot, and there's a lot of influence there from him. But I acknowledge like there are things that like you can't maintain, like if, for example, I'm incorrect, then he actually is anti-metaphysical in the generic sense, then obviously those are issues that you have to, provide your qualifications. You have to reject that. You got to work around that. I just don't think I have to do that at this point. So for me, it's a challenging relationship because it brings you to the brink of things that you're like, dang, like a couple wrong moves here and I'm really messed up. And so working with him as a Christian is a very tedious and trying task at times. He's very enjoyable to read. He's a very interesting guy. But at the end of the day, he wasn't a Christian in like a strict sense, and so responding to him as a Christian is definitely one of those things where I don't feel the need to, in the sense of like repudiating. It's like, well, like for example, in his biography, at one time he tried to join a monastery, become a religious.
Huh. Wow, that's like, fascinating. Yeah, that's really
So it's like, dude, he's just confused. And I don't feel the need to kick some guy when he's down.
Oh yeah.
And to just be honest, like it's like the guy's trying his best, and he's like, I just don't feel the need to go and antagonistically go after him. Like if he's wrong, I'm fine with critiquing him, but like interacting with him as a Christian, it's generally like he's a philosopher. I can take what's good and leave what's bad. Same we do with Aristotle and everyone else. So Interacting with him as a Christian has always been interesting. His moral sense is peculiar and interesting as well, and I think helpful. Yeah, I honestly haven't given too much thought to like interacting with him as a Christian because I haven't found any difficulties arising from him, at least in the way that I've been interpreting him and reading him and studying him and using him in my own philosophical projects. I just haven't encountered a tension there that requires me to put a lot of thought into that relationship, in that way at least. So, yeah, I think Christians should read him. I think, or philosophically inclined Christians should read him. Let me put it that way. And I think it's helpful in a lot of things and provides just interesting perspective. And if we can't interact with that in a hands-off way or in an open hand kind of way, then what are we really doing?
Right. Those are good points. I was about to say, so just to summarize, is it fair to say that what you're saying is you're looking more for a critical synthesis, appreciation, and appropriation in some regards, and then taking the good, leaving the bad, just like anyone else you would read. Is that fair to say?
Yeah. I don't see him as a particular enemy, nor do I see him as a particular friend. Like me personally, I would consider him like a long lost friend because I read him. I'm like, I get this guy, But like, I mean, like he's not an ally, but he's also not an enemy.
Yeah,
if you're to conceive of like your intellectual activities as like a war, like he's not helping your enemies per se. He can, like, the enemies can use him in a way to help them. But I don't know if that's consensual, right? In that sense, right? Like, is that actually what he's doing?
Right.
I don't know. Right. I don't think so. So I just see him as kind of like a neutral figure where it's like you can draw from him or you cannot. That's fine. His influence, I think, is why, if you're philosophically inclined and a Christian, is why you should read him and be familiar, because he's probably the two most influential 20th century philosophers, I think, are pretty clearly Martin Heidegger and Wittgenstein. So
yeah, it's also important to note, just like as you pointed out before, how his best and closest student was a faithful and devout Roman Catholic. So did she?
I know there's people who want her to be canonized.
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
Yeah. So like, yeah, she's dope, dude. Anscombe's like awesome.
Yeah. Did she say anything about whether or not his thought was like compatible with Catholicism?
She uses it all the time in her writings. So if that's evidence.
So more so
she
like
borrows from him.
Okay. So more so
method, even content, and even remarks. Like she'll borrow from like, yeah, I had a conversation where Wittgenstein, I was looking at this problem and he just said, why can't it be this? And she'll like use that. So like not just like methodological, but like positive insights into things.
Oh, okay.
Into philosophical problems. So like I just see him as like he reading Wittgenstein is like having a relationship. Like it sounds cliche, kind of gay, whatever, but like like he's so peculiar, you have to like get to know him through his writings. And once you do, you're like, oh, okay, I can see some things here. And I think, I don't know, I personally have a very positive kind of relationship with him. I know other people have very negative ones. And I don't mean to delegitimize other people's readings of him because it's such a convoluted world of interpretation that, at a certain point, they could be totally right and I could be totally wrong. I just haven't found any really convincing evidence of that as of yet, at least. So yeah, as a Christian, it's just, you look at him and you're like, you have really good points on certain things. You have bad points on others. You're unclear in general, which is his biggest weakness, is a lack of clarity. But where he is clear is usually really helpful. I think a big way to look at reading him, if you're like a philosophically inclined Christian, is kind of like the method that Poivet sets out in his book after Wittgenstein's St. Thomas, where he argues essentially that you should basically Wittgenstein is kind of a propedeutic reading. You can read Wittgenstein as a preparation to entering into the recovery of scholastic categories in St. Thomas.
Oh,
This is where his
wow.
philosophy of mind is really important, because Wittgenstein's primary focus, another book on this, is by Eric P. Litwack, Wittgenstein and Value from Continuum. There's a great chapter in here on language games, private language, and the private language argument in aspect psychology, where he argues, wow, Michael, retarded. Here it is. In its diverse varieties, this conception of the mental has been salient in the works of thinkers as varied as Descartes and Locke and some contemporary cognitists and functionalists in psychology and the philosophy of mind. That is what this guy presents as Wittgenstein's primary target. He calls it the subjectivist conception of meaning. And by that, it's like the meaning is in my mind of the word, and there's no external component to meaning. It's just like beetle box. You have a picture of a beetle box in your head. I have a picture of a beetle box in my head. And there's no way for my picture of the beetle box to be identical to yours. And so therefore skepticism. That's Wittgenstein's opponent, at least in philosophy of mind and epistemology, which is huge in philosophical investigations. That's a primary component there. And so with stuff like that, it's like I see him as someone who can help us overcome. I see Wittgenstein as someone who can help us overcome the modern tendencies that have enraptured our minds. You see examples of that in other books, like Herbert Dreyfus and Charles Taylor wrote this book called Retrieving Realism. Dreyfus is a Heideggerian scholar. Charles Taylor is the one who wrote A Secular Age.
Right. I need to get a hold of that.
Yeah, this is a great book, actually. Basically, what it's arguing is epistemology and philosophy of mind between mediational ideas and contact theories. Contact theory, they would argue, is Plato and Aristotle, where the mind, or whatever you want to call that, has direct contact with the reality around it. There's nothing mediating the relationship. Whereas the mediational theories would be Descartes, Locke, etc., where the idea in the mind is the mediational component, because there's no identity between the form in the mind and the form in the thing. In Aristotle, right, the mind becomes one with the object of knowledge. So therefore, the idea isn't actually a mediating force, it's a unitive force in your philosophy of mind and epistemology. They argue in this book, using Heidegger, Wittgenstein, and other contemporary philosophers, that they're attacking this Cartesian mind and world picture. And I think you can use Wittgenstein, that's one example of where you can use Wittgenstein to just destroy something that's distinctly modern, philosophically problematic, and that we've all rejected, but yet we can't find our way back for some stupid reason to the sensical path. But there's this passage where he says, a picture has held us captive and we could not get outside it, for it lay in our language and language seemed to repeat it to us inexorably. That's paragraph 115. And that's just kind of like that's their launch pad in this book to arguing their points. And if you read the philosophical investigations, you see where he's critiquing Descartes. In fact, in many ways, his quotation of Augustine in the Confessions isn't really a critique of Augustine. It's really a critique of the picture theory of meaning, which was his own view previously, and even possibly Cartesian interpretations of that picture theory, the Cartesian elements that underlie that picture theory. It's not necessarily Augustine. I know it's a bold claim, but I'm not the only one to make it. There's been several people who have made that claim or claims parallel to it. But then there's also other people who will attack that claim. So it's a debated claim, but I think it makes sense of quite a lot. And there's some explicit passages in philosophical grammar where he clearly shows that he doesn't entirely repudiate this idea of language that Augustine, or that he takes Augustine as presenting, because there's also a misinterpretation of Augustine there, I think, going on. Check out Peter King's article on Augustine on language in the Cambridge Companion to Augustine. Peter King has a article, Augustine on I think it's just called Augustine on Language, yeah, where he
Oh, okay.
borrows from Christian teaching and a couple other texts to kind of show that perhaps common conceptions about Augustine's view of language that we get from Wittgenstein's criticism aren't actually correct. So Wittgenstein could also be wrong about what Augustine's saying, but not wrong about what he's wanting to critique. You see, those aren't mutually exclusive things. Because we know Wittgenstein used historical figures as kind of placeholders for often ideas that aren't necessarily truly theirs, but he uses them that way because he sees remnants or something. So using Wittgenstein as a propedeutic reading and study towards retrieving pre-modern conceptions of philosophy, I think is entirely possible.
Mm.
So that's one example of how a Catholic, especially a Catholic, I think Christians in general can read him, but a Catholic would, I feel, have more appreciative elements of the recovery of tradition than a stereotypical just generic Christian would have there.
Mm-hmm.
And it's also like the way in which that can bring you into like really engaging with contemporary philosophical discussion, the defense of the Catholic philosophical tradition, and so on and so forth. Yeah, keep in mind, Poivet is a Catholic.
Oh, okay.
Like these are some of these people making some of these arguments are Catholics. Fergus Kerr is a Dominican, like I said, so on and so forth.
Right.
So, yeah, there's claims being made, and hey, man, they're good claims. So,
yeah, that's a fascinating world of Wittgenstein and his interpretation. One, I know you kind of answered this. You've mostly answered it rather substantially, but one of my other questions I was going to ask you was, who are Wittgenstein's main opponents? I know you spoke about Russell and or I mentioned Russell, then you added some commentary there, but what would you add to that? Either not just philosophical ideas or schools of thought, but also people, writers, etc.
so the Vienna School is something that he has a very tumultuous relationship with. To be honest, like everything. That's what's so funny about him. He just he's just like F at all this, like all of it. He's just like this, yep, screw that, yep, screw it. It's all screwed up, like all of it. But like particularly motivating components is Russell, Frege, Moore, AJ Ayer, the Vienna School. The later period, it's harder to tell. I know behaviorists or behavioralism, right? The idea in philosophical psychology is definitely an area of attack for him. And then functionalists, I think, in philosophical psychology are also areas of attack. It just depends. Like they vary. So a lot of things, but also himself. He's continually critiquing and revising his own work. So in many ways, himself is the primary opponent with other people as occasional opponents that work out his own thought process. But basically everybody.
Yeah, and do you
Schopenhauer,
mind?
Kant, everybody.
Okay, and do you mind just defining the Vienna School? Because the only Vienna School I'm familiar with in terms of philosophy is like with economics and like Adam Smith interpretation of like free markets and stuff
Okay.
like that.
Yeah. So the Vienna School basically is where logical positivism in the 20th century comes from, actually.
Oh, okay.
So AJ Ayer's Language, Truth, and Logic is like representative of the radical empiricist claims about epistemology, about metaphysics, all of it, language. Emotivism comes from this kind of philosophical school. So Wittgenstein has meetings with the Vienna School members, like the original ones and stuff like that. We have some of those conversations recorded. They interpret the Tractatus in a scientistic, logical, positivistic like tone. And he's like, no, it's not. And in fact, he responds to that kind of a reading in his lecture on ethics, where he talks about the emotivists see him as presenting their kind of view, or the logical positivist critique of ethics. They see it in the Tractatus, and he's like, no, it's not. This is what I'm saying. So yeah, logical positivism is essentially like David Hume on steroids plus scientism. So it's like David Hume's skepticism about metaphysics, but a confidence in science. It's David Hume and scientism having a baby, and then having that baby be a freak demonic being that like is a seemingly eternal thing. Like, it's disgusting. It's not
Gotcha.
fun. So yeah, scientism is a big target. Reductionistic views of philosophy or views of any issue really are also a big problem for him. Which I really think is just he's attacking like the nomenclature of Cambridge at the time. I think that's I can't prove that claim, but that's my suspicion. Is he's just looking at like the way that everyone's philosophizing. He's just like, this is meaningless and purposeless. What are you doing? Like, you're not actually doing anything. You're just saying a bunch of things without doing anything. So I'm like, that's fair. That's fair. There are times when philosophy does that, and it's like, yeah, bad practitioners of philosophy damage the soil of they soil the name.
Yeah, that's how in a similar line of thought, I remember years back this when I read Marx's the Communist Manifesto, and that taking place in the background of inspired later on the 1840s various communist revolutions throughout Europe, Prussia, and France. It's interesting because in the beginning of the Communist Manifesto, one thing I agree with Marx, not that I'm a Marxist, but one thing I agree with Marx is that he said says, hitherto now many people have been writing a lot about philosophy, but the point of philosophy is to change the world. Basically, that's a paraphrase, but putting it into action and so forth. And again, of course, I have very critical of Marx and in different ways, especially as it's thought carried out in the 20th century.
Sure. For sure.
But as a principle, though, yes, like the point is just not to philosophize as an end in itself, even though intrinsically I think it's a good thing to do.
Sure.
But it needs to be transformative, and I think that to your point, I agree with that. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, a singular activity can have more than one end. Right.
Yep.
Like, there are proximate and improximate ends, mediate and immediate ends of a thing. So what's a good example? Yeah. See, the problem is sex is the only example that's coming to mind, which is not what I'm going to use. Actually, yeah, why not? Okay, so like Catholic sexual ethics, right? It's like, okay, sex and marriage is supposed to be a unitive force, but also a procreative force.
Mm-hmm.
The reason why, it wouldn't be a sin in Catholic theology to have sex when your wife's pregnant is because it's still that unitive end is being achieved, right? Mm-hmm. The other end has already been achieved. She's pregnant. Okay, this other end can continue to be achieved and developed. So, like, philosophy in many ways is similar to that. There's a proximate end of like gaining knowledge, which I see as associative of like the changing of oneself, right?
Yeah.
Like that's I don't really see that as any distinct. And then there is a sense in which philosophy's proximate goal, or that would be I would say the change itself is a proximate goal, and then the improximate goal would be the changing of the external world because of the implications from which the changing of myself then goes into the world. Yeah, I see what you're saying for sure. In that element, and I would agree. I think Wittgenstein also is helpful in those ways as well.
Yeah, and that leads me to my next segues really well into my next question is, if Wittgenstein was alive today, what do you think he would say about modern culture, philosophy, religion? I know you some of the books you picked off the shelf he wrote on, or at least in the secondary literature, talked about his views on culture. What do you think he would say today about culture and just how the world is?
Oh man, I mean, I think he definitely would not laugh, he'd be angry. That was the interesting thing. He is a man who is prone to frustration. He would be frustrated with our presumed lack of religiousness. He would be like, "What are you talking about? That's dumb. You're religious." like he would. I honestly think he would see technology as a new form of religion.
Oh, interesting. That's fascinating.
Like but one to which we've already fallen asleep.
Hmm.
Because like his idea, the goal for philosophy, I think in him is to awaken you to wonder. Hence The Fate of Wonder in this book. I actually think he very excellently argues that. The goal of philosophy in Wittgenstein is to awaken the person to wonder, which is also a fair inversion of Aristotle, right? Aristotle's operating in a context where wonder is the presumed de facto thing. You know, the world is full of gods, right? Thales. Wittgenstein is living in a world where science seeks to explain away everything. And so I think today he would be aghast at the extent to which science has, how we've allowed science and our learning to eschew away wonder. As if science can really give a complete explanation of the world that ceases to produce questions.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, this goes back to his critique in the Tractatus. Like, there's a whole section on it where he critiques. I think it's in 6. Yeah, 6.3 kind of onwards, where he talks about the notion of law of causality, Newtonian mechanics, and he talks about how the whole modern conception of the world is founded on the illusion that the so-called laws of nature are the explanations of natural phenomenon. Thus, people today stop at the laws of nature, treating them as something inviolable, just as God and fate were treated in past ages. In fact, both are right and wrong, though the view of the ancients is clearer insofar as they have a clear and acknowledged terminus, while the modern system tries to make it look as if everything were explained. That's Tractatus 6.372. And so, like, when you get into this kind of view of the world, I think Wittgenstein would very clearly see immense problems with the way that we want to engage technology and science. Science has put us to sleep to the reality of the world. Technology awakened us to an artificial reality, and then we've already fallen asleep because of a customization to that. And so we have already are in a deeper state of lacking wonder, because we believe that explanation does away with meaning and questions.
Yeah.
Like, explanation is ostensive, and he's just like, that's dumb.
Yeah.
So I think he would see things like that as deeply problematic. I think he would see the ways that technology shapes us as individuals, and how these, like, I'm assuming that he would bring it down to technology, because I actually think that this is where a lot of his thought can be applied in criticisms about our concepts of understanding and explanation, like the purpose of explanation, because he'll deny explanation as the purpose of his philosophy, but then posit description in the later writings. And so he sees a big difference. I think explanation is something which does away with any possible continuing questions or doubts or inadequacies or other things like that, whereas description is just attempting to understand the thing. That's my, like, really loose proverbial kind of like reading. I haven't done a ton of studying on that dichotomy. I need to read more about that, because I actually think that could be a really big key to understanding his philosophical methodology. That would be like huge. So I think he'd be very upset with things like that. I think the hypersexualization of the world would bother him to an insane degree. Like I said, he was extremely ascetic and didn't seem to have like many sexual desires. If any. Like, there's times where it's like he wanted to be with this woman, but, like, you know, didn't work out. And then other times he's like, I don't want children. I want a childless marriage, which is euphemistic for no sex. And so I think today he would see a lot of problems in our culture. In contemporary philosophy, I think he would say a lot of it is like, what do you call it? Caltrop, like just nonsense, just garbage. I think you'd see a lot of it as just useless, wasteful garbage. I think like the contemporary society and world, like not just in a cultural sense, but like in a more broad sense, I think he would become a hermit, actually.
Huh, interesting.
I think if it was as severe, like if you didn't change his dispositions, right? You took his dispositions that he would have had from his time and you just throw him in today.
Yeah.
I think it would be too much for him. Like if back then was too much for him to go in exile for 10 years in the middle of nowhere in the Netherlands.
Right. Yeah, I can only imagine.
Okay. Yeah, like I don't feel like my postulation there is really that unreasonable. He probably would have just become a monk and just been like, bye, deuces. Like, I don't blame him, man. Like, frick. Yeah, I would be kind of like my guesses. I don't really know though to like a full extent. He was a big cultural critic. Ray Monk talks a lot about that in his biography. So if you read that, you might be able to get some better ideas there. But yeah, he definitely had a lot to say, and he wouldn't be happy.
Yeah,
he'd be an angry camper.
Intellectual curmudgeon.
Yeah, I don't blame him. Why not?
Yeah. So, well, thank you. That's really fascinating. And I guess I guess I'll put this. This will be the last question, and then we'll wrap up. But what do you think? What was did Wittgenstein? Was there something in his writings that he thought was true, and then later he changes his mind on it? Says, actually, I was wrong on this.
Yeah. The picture theory. He thought the picture theory of language in the Tractatus was complete, and then he later saw it as incomplete. But as Anthony Kenny argues in this book, and then also another book that he did on Wittgenstein, if I can get it, which is called The Legacy of Wittgenstein. Both these two books have a series of articles and chapters in them where he argues that the major elements of the picture theory survive into the later period and are modified. And so you might want to see his later writings as supplemental to this. I don't know. It's hard because Wittgenstein himself will say like very aggressive and harsh things about his early writings, but then and critique them. But Anthony Kenny can show in his articles quite convincingly that Wittgenstein might have overestimated the degree to which there's discontinuity in his own writings. And so I think Kenny's suggestion has a good bit of weight to it. Kenny seems to show that pretty well, that point of difference. So the picture theory is one example of that. I would see that as a primary example. Honestly, I don't see in like the early Tractarian views, like I don't see a lot of like, okay, so like in Culture and Value, he talks about how he has not like invented a line of thinking. What he has done is taken these ideas and sought clarification and elucidation. And I think you see that very much with the Tractatus. It's clearly borrowing from Russell and Frege, but in it is a very veiled and pretty brutal critique of their views. I do not fully understand it because I do not know how to read the symbolic notation very well that they use. I'm working on that as well. I have a lot of work to do in these kinds of areas. But nonetheless, like it seems clear that yes, here, I don't believe I have ever invented a line of thinking. I have always taken over one from someone else. I have simply straight away seized on with enthusiasm for my work of clarification. That's in Culture and Value 19E. So I think if you see that in his writings that he picks these people and tries to clarify their thought and then kind of gets to his own place. I actually don't think in some ways that Wittgenstein starts doing like his own philosophy strictly until the later period in a certain sense. Um, but then again, I don't know. I go back and forth. But the picture theory is an easy example of something that where he modifies or rejects previous views. But again, his whole life is a process of modification. So all of
Gotcha.
his writing, I mean, that's why you have like the difference between the philosophical remarks and philosophical grammar, right? Is like 3 years of difference, but like quite substantial developments are occurring. And of course, the nuances of those, I probably could not just off the top of my head like spur off, but nonetheless, his use of language are definitely in development constantly, and his concept of knowledge and philosophy of mind, stuff like that, is always moving. So, yeah, it would be.
Yeah.
There's a lot there.
Yeah. Good stuff. And actually, I'm sorry, I take it back. This should be the last question. And I know it sounds a little bit redundant, but try to be, I guess, summative, maybe in like 5 or 10 points. Why should people read Wittgenstein? Or why does he matter?
So why Wittgenstein? Okay. Why Wittgenstein? What's the audience? Because I mean, like just anybody, or
I guess why should people that are starting out either in apologetics or trying to get into a philosophy, yeah, so anyone in that crowd, anyone trying to get into philosophy, theology, philosophy, literature, whether they're a student, whether they just want to be an informed layperson,
okay.
getting into these things, regardless of background, but united in interest.
So then, yeah. So why? Okay. So one, he's too influential. He's extremely influential, and because of that, if you're interested in these things, eventually you're going to have to get around to it. So why wait? Just do it. Two, I think that his views will combat distinctly modern concepts of the world that you have, even if you don't realize it, even if you've been raised a Christian your whole life. I don't think you can avoid it. You will think about knowledge, the world, the way your mind relates to the world as a modern. He can start reawakening you to wonder, I think. As a moral therapeutic kind of approach, I think he will genuinely awaken. So a distinct point. So 1, 2, third point. His method, I think, works. I think his method's actually very Socratic in some ways. And I actually find it to be in some ways a kind of moral therapy where it can reawaken you to wonder about the world, which is slightly distinct from the other one, because that one's more overcoming modern conceptions of the world. This one's more like becoming awake to the world. He talks about this kind of stuff in Lecture on Ethics, where he talks about
No, you're
talks
fine.
about like the viewing the he says I believe the best way of describing what he means by ethics or absolute value is when one wonders at the existence of the world. I'm inclined to use such phrases as how extraordinary that anything should exist, or how extraordinary that the world should exist. And it's like, okay, like most people these days conceive of philosophy in a scientific manner where the purpose of philosophy is to remove doubt, right? Like we're so anti-Cartesian, or we want to be so anti-Cartesian that we don't realize the degree to which we're actually Cartesian. And it's annoying. And I think Wittgenstein will tell you, hey, cut it out. Those are 3 reasons on top of my head that I can think of. 4th reason, he's a fun personality. He's interesting. So if you're someone who likes interesting people, good luck finding someone who's more interesting. In terms of like his personality, like he's a weird dude. Funny too. And he's relatable. Like he's real. Like he's honestly a relatable person in many ways, despite the differences that may exist between genius and non-genius. He's a very relatable person, and so I find his writings helpful in that sense. And if you're a student, well, I'm sure you're looking for some type of research area. The amount of secondary literature on Wittgenstein is Innumerous. I have 3 shelves. I have a quarter of, not even a quarter. I have a drop in an ocean of what's out there in terms of work on him. So if you're a student looking to find a topic to become passionate about in the study, hey, suggestion here. You know, and like there's stuff like, for example, there's a whole world of information out there on like comparing Wittgenstein and St. Thomas on a variety of topics. A really popular and common one is on intention, actually. Yeah, it's like there's a lot of stuff out there on him, and he's versatile. So, okay, another distinct reason would be that he's versatile as a philosopher. His thoughts can be taken and applied to a variety of different topics, and so no matter what your area of interest is, you can use that. And so, if you treat his method as a toolbox, which is how he describes it in the philosophical investigations and philosophical grammar, like philosophy as being a toolbox in which there are many tools, there are many therapies that we can use. And you can find some of these helpful. So yeah, I think those would be just kind of like a last, like, why read this? It's just, those are kind of the reasons I would enumerate.
Gotcha. Well, yeah, thank you for you know, summarizing that for all of us. And you know, I know you listed, you know, you pulled a lot of books down, but are there any more books of his that you would suggest for everyone here to go and read that you didn't pull down?
So books that I'd recommend to like read that I didn't pull off would be, this would be a really good one. I thought a book was about to fall and kill me.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, ironic. How to Read Wittgenstein by Ray Monk. It's a little small book. It's short. Like, I mean, it's really small. It's like not even 100. It's just over 100 pages. This is kind of like a really brief introduction. I'm reading it with a friend right now.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, like a lot of the books that I mentioned, you know, primary sources, I kind of covered all the main ones. Like there's so much. Like, for example, I only just found out like a month ago about this manuscript called the Big Typescript. I'd seen it mentioned, but like we have so many small manuscripts that are like 10 pages, 20 pages. They're often not published. So I assumed it was one of those, right? I was wrong. See, I knew it would happen.
Oh.
I knew it would happen. It's trying to kill me.
Raining books.
The Big Typescript is like 1,000 pages. It's huge. It's the biggest book that we have by him. And I just found out about it like a month ago and I was like, crap, I'm screwed. So yeah, I would recommend the Ray Monk book. I would recommend Anthony Kenny's that I mentioned, the Wittgenstein Dictionary by that guy, by Glock. I mean, honestly, like those are like the ones I pull down are the main ones I'd recommend. Like a lot of my study has been on like his concept of like ethics and applying his philosophy to ethics, and so a lot of the sources that I'm familiar with would kind of be in that vein of study. So yeah, I mean, I would definitely just kind of stick with the ones that I mentioned. I mean, even some of them are already particularized to that kind of area of interest. Just trying to think. I mean, also there's this series. I don't necessarily agree with the interpretations presented in the series often. I might have variances between them, but the Routledge GuideBook series has ones on the Tractatus and the investigations.
Oh, okay. Nice.
This one's by Mary McInn, and it's pretty good. I don't agree with everything, but there's definitely some good stuff in here that could be helpful. And so, yeah, this would definitely be like a useful source. So all the ones I mentioned, plus those two, probably would be like what I would go with for like someone who's like starting out reading him. Especially with the primary literature, I think there's plenty in what I've mentioned to keep someone busy for quite some time, if not a whole year. So.
Gotcha. Yeah. Well, thank you for that. And is there anything you would like to, you know, before we go here, is there anything you would like to plug? I know you have a blog. What's your blog name again?
It's called The Rational Animal. It's just kind of It's not quite a normal blog. I kind of use it as just a place to just kind of present my thoughts on different things, and it's really more of like a personal project of like I call it a digital record of thought, in like the kind of introductory post. So I just started it recently. I have all kinds of ideas to write. I'm working on them. So it's not like a stereotypical blog, but if you're a nerdy person who likes philosophy, like, yeah, come down. I got some nerd stuff for you. I got some drugs, kids. Drugs of the mind. Drugs of the mind. Or
Clarify.
immaterial drugs. Drugs. The drugs are the ideas, right? Plato was high on the ideas. That's what you want. Trust me.
That's great.
So yeah, I got that. I have an academia page where I put a lot of my papers. So that's cool.
Oh, good.
Yeah, those are really the two main ways I'm doing stuff right now, is at least publicly. So yeah, that's why I would like to plug the Rational Animal and my academia page. Go read my papers, critique them.
Cool.
Let me know.
And that's just under Michael Hall on Academia.
Yeah, I can send you links so you can put them in the description if you want for the video.
Yeah,
So
definitely. Yeah. All right. Well, everyone, first off, thank you, Michael, for taking the time to be on here and giving us a very thorough, meaty, interview and discussion on Wittgenstein. We're at 2 hours or so or more. So I loved every minute of it, and just want to thank you again, and I'd love to have you back on to talk either Nietzsche or Charles Taylor or any other philosopher or whatever.
Let's do it. Thanks for having me on. It was a lot of fun. We should do McIntyre sometime.
Yeah, you know what? Because I haven't finished After Virtue. I started it, and then work, and then other stuff happened, and then I just got lost in reading papacy books and forgot. So yeah, I'd like to.
Yeah, I plan on picking it up here soon again to reread. I'm reading like 20 books at the same time.
Gotcha.
But I plan on rereading that eventually and digging into some of his other works more thoroughly as well. So I'd be interested in doing like maybe like a deep dive on just that one book. That'd be cool.
Yeah, it would be cool. I'd love to do a kind of a book, kind of like a sort of book club / interview with you on it, and kind of basically what I would like to do is read the book, underline some things, and then like read off my highlights, ask you for your highlights, and then like our thoughts and so forth. Yeah,
sounds great. I'd love to do that. It'd be super fun.
Yeah, well, thank you, everyone. This has been James's Interviews, episode 2. My guest today was Michael Hall, and we talked about the philosopher Wittgenstein. So I'm here producing different videos, and right now, I'm just focused on quality over quantity. And as we go through, eventually, juggle stuff in my own schedule with work, and then next spring and January, I will be starting school at Franciscan University of Steubenville. So prayers for me in that. And that will probably slow things down. So I'm trying to get some more stuff up for the rest of 2021. And, but yeah, so look forward to that. And thank you, everyone, for tuning in. Like, comment, and subscribe. And thank you again, Michael. It's been great.
Yeah, thanks, man.